Welcome, everyone. I think we're going to get started today. Good morning. My name is Maya Locker, and I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator here at the museum at Eldridge Street. Thank you so much for joining us for this Zoom program with Dr. Michael Nevins about the literary history of aging throughout history. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, so it's a really exciting start to this program series. I have turned on live captioning for accessibility, which is powered by AI, so please forgive any mistakes that you may see. We will be having a Q&A at the very end of the program where I will enable you to unmute yourselves and ask Dr. Nevins any questions that you may have. In the meantime, please feel free to leave any questions in the chat and I can ask them for you at the end. For those who haven't visited us before, I'd love to just put a picture of the museum on the screen. We'd love to have you at the museum at Aldrich Street. For those of you who don't know, it was built in 1887, and it was the first grand house of worship built by Eastern European Jews in the United States. And it was nearly lost to neglect in the mid-20th century before our massive restoration project brought it back to its former glory and for public use. We offer both in-person and virtual programming here at the museum, all about the story of immigrant life. On the Lower East Side, we explore architecture, historic preservation, and we inspire reflection on cultural continuity. And you can find all our public programming listed on our website at eldridgestreet.org/events. So we'd love to see you for all of our in-person and virtual programming coming up. I want to thank Dr. Nevins not only for leading this program, which is the first in a 4-part series on aging well, but for organizing this entire endeavor, from producing our in-person panel discussion that we held last week, to producing this virtual series where we will be joined by experts who will discuss the religious, medical, and ethical dimensions of aging. Some of these experts who we'll be meeting in the next weeks are here with us today, so welcome to all of you. And these next 3 virtual seminars will be held weekly on Wednesdays at 11 a.m. And now I'd like to introduce you all to Dr. Nevins. Dr. Michael Nevins is a retired internist, cardiologist who practiced for nearly 4 decades in northern New Jersey. He grew up in the Bronx, graduated from Dartmouth College and Tufts Medical School, and he was active in bioethics, geriatrics, and medical education. You can read more about Dr. Nevins and his work, his copious writing, which I would encourage you all to check out on his website at michaelnevinsmd.com. And with that, I'd like to turn the screen over to Dr. Nevins. Thank you so much for doing this with us, Dr. Nevins.
Oh, most welcome. Thank you, Maya, and welcome to all of you who tuned in this morning. I'm grateful to Maya for coordinating these events and unburdening me from having to juggle the slides this morning because I'm kind of a technophobe, so I can focus on the talk rather than the pictures. I'd also like to thank the museum's directors, Bonnie Dimon and Sophie Lowe, for arranging these programs about aging well. And as Maya mentioned, 2 weeks ago, we had a stimulating panel discussion at the museum in Chinatown. But since today we're going virtual, I'm speaking to you from my cozy Riverside apartment in Rockland County. And I don't think you have to have been an English major in college like I was to understand today's subject matter, which will be a survey of various things that have been written about aging and ageism during different times and places in history. So the modern world record for longevity seems to have been held by a French woman, a Madame Calment, who died in 1997 at age 122, smoking till the end. The oldest male seems to have lived to 116. Now, we all know that Mel Brooks claimed to be a 2,000-year-old man, but in truth, currently he's only 97, so he still has quite a ways to go. There's a less familiar humorist, the poet Judith Viorst. She's now 92, and every 10 years since she reached 30, she's written a book of funny poems describing her recent experiences. The first one, the title was, It's Hard to Be Hip Over 30 and Other Tragedies of Married Life. And the most recent book that appeared 4 years ago was called Nearly 90 and Other Comedies of Late Life. Well, I've read them all and hope to be around for Judith Yorst's next book, which is due to appear in 2031, I guess. And I like to imagine that it might be called 100 at Last and What's Next? So let's begin now in the beginning, which is a good place to start. And according to Genesis, in the beginning, God said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years." But elsewhere, the Bible says that Abraham reached what he called the ripe old age of 175. And then in Psalms, we're told that the days of our years are 80 years and 10. And if by reason of strength they be 80, it is soon cut off and we fly away. Well, as far as I know, Adam didn't fly away. And I guess Elijah climbed away, but supposedly Adam lived 930 years, and presumably Eve lasted for about the same time, although it's not specified. And then, of course, we've got to deal with Methuselah, who made it to 969. So it seems that our forefathers couldn't make up their minds about length of life. And since the Bible didn't provide any explanations or details, all we can do is speculate about all those discrepancies. And so I won't even try. Elsewhere, the Bible declared that those people who are given the gift of long life are to be adorned, honored, respected, and esteemed. And in the book of Job, it said that wisdom belongs to the aged and understanding to the old. And then in Proverbs, it added gray hairs are a crown of honor gained by a good life. So it appeared that living a long life really wasn't such a bad thing. Now, curiously, King Solomon the Wise seemed to have lived less long than the others I've mentioned, described separately as either age 59 or 92. And perhaps that was because he had 700 wives and 300 concubines in his harem. So I suspect maybe he just wore out. And someone suggested that his nocturnal proclivities prove that Solomon wasn't so wise after all. I don't know about that. The ancient Greeks and Romans seem to have held negative attitudes about old age, rather similar to what's prevalent today, but some authors seemed sympathetic. So, for example, this fellow in the 8th century BCE, this is Homer, wrote in the Odyssey that warm baths, good food, soft sleep, and generous wine are the rights of age. And in the Iliad, he described an elderly chieftain by the name of Nestor as being long-winded and fond of singing his own praises. But in general, Homer was affectionate about Nestor and declared that this old-timer deserved to be respected. In the Republic, Plato quoted Socrates as saying, "I enjoy talking with very old people. They have gone before us on a road by which we too may have to travel, and I think we do well to learn from them what it is like." And then in the 5th century BCE, the Greek poet Sophocles was dragged into court by his sons when he reached age 90 on the charge that he was incapable of managing his own financial affairs. Sophocles cleverly earned his acquittal by reading out to the jury some of the lines from a play he was currently working on in about 400 BCE. It was called Oedipus at Colonus, which was about the old and blind Oedipus. And after reading it, he demanded of the jury, "Do you think that's the work of an idiot?" Good question. the Roman orator Cicero, at age 62, wrote a book about old age in which he said that old people can be lively and full of beans. I don't understand that reference to beans, but it seems that he meant that some people never stop learning, however old they are. And elsewhere, Cicero wrote that it is not by muscle, speed, or physical dexterity that great things are achieved, but by reflection, force of character, and judgment. In these qualities, old age is usually not only poorer, but may even be richer. And it seems that Cicero enjoyed the company of old friends and savored leaving behind early struggles with lust and ambition, quarreling, and other passions. And he wrote that the second half of life can be the best part. And he suggested it's a time when you might discover that gardening and reading actually are more pleasurable than sex ever was. Another time, Cicero wrote that an actor does not need to remain on stage throughout the play. It's enough that he appears in appropriate acts, and that the last act must take place as surely as the fruits of trees and the earth someday will wither and fall. And yet another time there was this: if there were no old men, there would be no civilized states at all. And think about that in terms of our current politics. Moving on, everyone knows about William Shakespeare's doddering octogenarian King Lear. And some of you also may be familiar with the section in As You Like It, which was written in 1600. And that section is known as the 7 Ages of Man. And it begins, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. Well, I'm not going to read the first 5, which were in order: the infant, the schoolboy, the lover, the soldier, and the justice. But here's what the bard said about the last 2 ages. He writes, the 6th age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon with spectacles on nose and pouch on side. His youthful hose, well saved, a world too wide for his shrunk shank, and his big manly voice turning again toward childish treble, pipes and whistles in his sound. The last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is second childishness and mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. Kind of a grim description. In Henry V, Shakespeare wrote, a good leg will fall, a straight back will stoop, a black beard will turn white, a curled pate will grow bald, a fair face will wither, a full eye will wax hollow. Yet in Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare wrote about the queen, age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Again, in the Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare wrote, with mirth and laughter, let old wrinkles come. And in Macbeth, he suggested that honor, love, obedience, and troops of friends should accompany old age. Incidentally, the cause of Shakespeare's death at age 50 remains a mystery, and it's been speculated that he may have died of syphilis or even that he might have been murdered. But think of what he might have written if he'd lived even 80 or even longer. Next, Sir Thomas More was a contemporary of Shakespeare who had a rather different attitude. In his novel, which was titled Utopia, it was published in 1516, he imagined a perfect society existing on an island called Utopia that was located somewhere in the recently discovered New World. And I'm going to read several paragraphs from Utopia that concern medical care at the end of life some 500 years ago. It goes this way. When people are permanent invalids, the nurses try to make them feel better by sitting and talking to them and do all they can to relieve their symptoms. But besides being incurable, the disease also causes constant excruciating pain. Some priests and government officials visit the person concerned and say something like this: let's face it, you'll never be able to live a normal life. You're just a nuisance to other people and a burden to yourself. In fact, you're really leading a sort of posthumous existence. So why go on feeding germs? Since your life's a misery to you, why don't you break out and escape to a better world? Or say the word and we'll arrange for your release. It's only common sense to cut your losses. It's also an act of piety to take the advice of a priest because he speaks to God. If the patient finds these arguments convincing, he either starves himself to death or is given a soporific and put painlessly out of his misery. But this is strictly voluntary, and if he prefers to stay alive, everyone will go on treating him as kindly as ever. Officially sanctioned euthanasia, this is still Thomas More speaking, is regarded as an honorable death, but if you commit suicide for reasons which the priests and the bench eaters do not consider adequate, you forfeit all rights to burial or cremation, and your body is thrown unceremoniously into a pond. I guess the Eskimos might send them off on a ice floe. So that's very interesting. So long ago. We'll talk about euthanasia again shortly, but in 1605, that's about a century after Thomas More, this is what Francis Bacon said about the challenge of end-of-life care. He said this: I esteem it likewise to be clearly the office of a physician, not only to restore health, but also to mitigate the pains and torments of diseases, and not only when such mitigation of pain as of a dangerous symptom helps and conduces to recovery, but also when all hope of recovery being gone, it serves only to make a fair and easy passage from life. So here was a very early suggestion of what today we might call palliative care, of easing the pains and torments of diseases. And now I'm going to fast forward from Elizabethan to Victorian England. And in 1880, the prolific Victorian novelist Anthony Trollope suggested a radical new approach in one of his last works that in some respects recalled Thomas More's Utopia that I just mentioned. This was a satiric novel that was called The Fixed Period, and its plot required mandatory euthanasia for everyone upon reaching the age of 67 and a half. Whether or not they were willing or unwell, everybody it's time to go. So this book by Trollope told the history of a fictional island republic called Britannula. Its subjects had fled New Zealand some 30 years earlier, and then they severed political relations with Great Britain. And at that time, all of the settlers were relatively young, and when they got around to establishing a legal system, they insisted upon compulsory euthanasia in order to abolish what they called the miseries and imbecilities of old age, as well as the expense of caring for the non-productive elderly. And this was seen as an obligatory act of altruism. And it anticipated what a century later would be called ageism. And I'll talk more about that in due time. Told in the first person by the president of this new republic, a man by the name of Mr. Neverbend, the time of action was projected a century into the future to the distant year 1980. And Trollope foresaw that by then, people would be transported by wonderful steam tricycles. They could converse over great distances using wireless devices. They could attend international cricket matches contested by teams of professional athletes. And after much debate, these Britannulists agreed that upon attaining the age of 66 and a half, all citizens would be deposited in a college-like campus. And they'd spend more than a year there of dignified retirement and contemplation. But when they reached the age of 67 and a half, a euthanasia was to be prepared for them, and they would, in quotes, depart. The victims' veins would be opened while they were immersed in a warm bath and given chloroform. Well, this legislation was intended to assure what they called a decent and comfortable departure, and it was justified not only on the basis of economics, but because it would spare the elders from a useless and painful life. But by the time of the narrative that was set 30 years after that law was enacted, the citizens began to have misgivings. And just when the first unlucky senior was being led away to college, an English warship with a marvelous new technology, a 250-ton cannon, appeared in the harbor. Mr. Neverbend was taken prisoner, the island reverted to English rule, and the odious law was rescinded. And I like to imagine Gilbert and Sullivan putting this fabulous story to music. But that wasn't the end. Several months after the fixed period was published in 1882, Anthony Trollope died after having a stroke. And ironically, he was 67 years old at the time, an age when he would be approaching his own obligatory departure were he living on the fictional island. Now, although Trollope's novel is little remembered today, a quarter century later, in 1905, it caused a sensation when this man, the famous Dr. William Osler, spoke at the Johns Hopkins medical commencement and gave a farewell speech before he departed for England, where he would become a professor of medicine at Oxford. At that time, Osler was 56 years old, and he was regarded as the most respected physician in the world. And his speech he called The Fixed Period after Trollope's novel. What Osler had in mind was not a fixed period of biologic life, but of academic life. And he cited two of his own long-held fixed ideas. And the first was about the comparative uselessness of men above 40 years of age. And he said that the most what he called vitalizing, meaning creative work in most fields, is done between the ages of 25 and 40 years. And he described what he called the anabolic or constructive period, in which there is always a balance in the mental bank and the credit is good. And Osler's second fixed idea was the intellectual uselessness of most men above 60 years of age. And he argued that it would benefit commercial, political, and professional affairs if, as a matter of course, men stopped working at this age. And this is what Dr. Osler explained. He wrote, the teacher's life should have three periods: study until 25, investigation until 40, profession until 60, at which age I would have him retired on a double allowance. And whether Trollope's suggestion of a college and chloroform should be carried out or not I have become a little dubious as my own time is getting so short. Well, Osler's words were intended to be humorous, but they were distorted by journalists reporting the events. And as his colleague Harvey Cushing wrote in his biography of Osler, the storm did not break until the next day when it was headlined throughout the country. One of them said, Osler recommends chloroform at 60. Dr. Osler protested, said he'd been misunderstood, held his ground, though, saying, I meant just what I said, but it's disgraceful, this fuss that the newspapers are making about it. I know that there are exceptions, but they only serve to illustrate the rule. As for chloroforming men at 60, that was only a pleasantry. Well, a dispatch published in the British medical journal, The Lancet, noted that the great stir among American journalists in response to Osler's speech reflected that the Americans are somewhat deficient in a sense of humor when they themselves are directly concerned. And indeed, excuse me, Osler's speech provoked an enormous response both from supporters and critics. Some people began to speak of Oslerizing the elderly, and one observer noted similarities between Osler's and Charles Darwin's opinions. After all, Darwin had written, what a good thing it would be if every scientific man was to die when 60 years old, as afterwards he would be sure to oppose all new doctrines. 11 years after his commencement speech at Hopkins, Dr. Osler recalled the incident this way. I had been reading Anthony Trollope's novel, The Fixed Period, and had been thinking of some professors who had remained at their posts after their period of usefulness was over. It was for them that I, with humorous intent, advocated chloroform as a peaceful means of retirement. The newspapers made much of it and misquoted it. Boys, do not read Trollope. He is dangerous. Well, today, we can appreciate how Osler's remarks were taken out of context and twisted. One of his modern biographers, Michael Bliss, suggested that at age 56, Osler had become a prisoner of his own preconception that creativity in science was a young man's talent. And Bliss noted that Dr. Osler was short-sighted about the possibility that medical progress might have an impact in delaying the ravages of time, as indeed it has. So Dr. Osler, who later would become Sir William Osler, once famously described pneumonia as being the old man's friend because it carried the victim away quickly. But when he died of pneumonia at age 70, it was distinctly unfriendly, and he suffered so much that his devoted physician provided a comfortable exit with a large dose of morphine. Incidentally, concerning euthanasia, literally translated from Greek, that word means an easy death. And during Trollope's and Osler's time, few people lived to 65 years or older. But in our own time, the demographics having changed, the aging of our society has serious implications that have to be confronted. Some call it a geriatric imperative. And again, more about that shortly. About the same time that Trollope's book was being serialized, the British polymath Francis Galton began writing about the comparative worth of different races, and he introduced the term eugenics to describe the process of strengthening the human race through selective breeding. And like Trollope, Galton was influenced by his half-cousin, Charles Darwin. And in the late 19th century, the term social Darwinism began to be used in order to explain human society in terms of natural selection. And indeed, both Darwinists and eugenicists believe that medical science could engineer social progress. So now let's consider some of that. Among the scientists who were concerned about how to live better, if not necessarily longer, was the Russian biologist Elie Metchnikov, who worked for a while at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And while there, he gave a public lecture titled Old Age, in which he said that aging was caused by harmful bacteria in the gut. And he urged his audience to boil fruits and vegetables in order to prevent noxious bacteria from entering the body. And instead, he suggested that beneficial bacteria need to be cultivated in the intestines, and this was best done by eating yogurt or other types of sour milk which contain the bacteria Lactobacillus bulgariscum. Metchnikoff wrote that this microbe is found in the sour milk consumed in large amounts by the Bulgarians, in a region well known for the longevity of its inhabitants, and therefore it was reasonable to suppose that introducing Bulgarian sour milk into the diet can reduce the harmful effect of the intestinal flora. And although Metchnikoff presented his ideas as a hypothesis, the next day Paris newspapers ran with the idea, like other newspapers ran with Osler's words. And one of them wrote, "Those of you pretty ladies and brilliant gentlemen who don't want to age or die, here's the precious recipe: eat yogurt." Well, in the United States, a headline in the Chicago Daily Tribune declared "Secret of Long Life Discovered by Professor Metchnikoff." And the British Medical Journal wrote, "Yogurt can be used for an indefinite time without harmful results if the dose is not too large. 2.2 pounds a day should not be exceeded." To counter sensational claims, in 1905, Metchnikoff published a brochure in which he wrote, "Clearly, we do not look upon the milk microbes as an elixir of longevity or a remedy against aging, but the question will be resolved only in a more or less distant future." But Professor Metchnikoff may have partially succumbed to the madness when he wrote that if science found a way to cure aging, that people could live 150 years. In 1908, when he shared the Nobel Prize in Medicine with Paul Ehrlich for their work on immunity, the New England Journal of Medicine wrote that everybody in this town has been taking Metchnikoff's milk with a fervor proportionate to the scientific authority of its promoter. And this set off a mania for buying pots of yogurt, and doctors began prescribing what was called Oriental curdled milk for anything from gonorrhea to gum disease. Another enthusiast for yogurt and diet was Dr. John Harvey Kellogg of cornflakes fame. When he visited Metchnikoff in Paris, he was impressed by the pitcher of sour milk that he saw sitting on the professor's desk. And in his own book, How to Have Good Health Through Biologic Living, Dr. Kellogg wrote that Metchnikoff has placed the whole world under obligation to him in his discovery that the flora of the human intestine needs changing. Kellogg had his own unconventional ideas about what kinds of change was necessary. Since almost all illness originated in the stomach and bowels, he counseled daily yogurt enemas to produce sparkling clean intestines, and he felt that most other diseases were caused by sexual intercourse. Indeed, the two Kellogg brothers ran a fashionable sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, where wealthy people were offered a vegetarian diet, exercise, and sexual abstinence. And in effect, their Spartan regimen could best be summarized as, if it feels good, it's bad for you. So in the eternal quest for long life, nowadays, many people gobble probiotics, so-called good bacteria. Several studies revealed that the intestinal flora, called now the microbiome, affects the lifespan of worms and flies. Also, among aquatic models that Metchnikoff used while developing his theories were jellyfish. And the professor seems to have been a brainy guy. After all, he won a Nobel Prize. But it makes me wonder whether he may have been swallowing the jellyfish himself. These days, for the supplement Prevagen, which is the ads are ubiquitous on television, And they claim that it's good for your brain because they claim it's made from the same chemical as what's in jellyfish. So you too can be as smart as a jellyfish, and you won't even need a prescription. You can buy Prevagen at CVS or Walgreens. In England, during the second half of the 19th century, perhaps as the result of the image of an aging Queen Victoria, there was public debate about the hazards of advancing age for society, just like there is currently with President Biden. And although Anthony Trollope, among others, had suggested that the elderly had become a burden on the younger generation, some people disagreed. One of them was Robert Browning, the poet, wrote a poem called Rabbi Ben Ezra in 1864 that began, "Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be, the last of life for which the first was made. Man's life as a whole, not youth alone with its passion and energy, nor old age with its spirituality, but a blend of the two together is what matters." Now, apparently that poem was about a real 12th century rabbi and poet by the name of Abraham ibn Ezra. And in it, Browning provided an affirmative image of Jewish old age. In fact, it was one of several poems that Browning wrote that contained positive representations of Jews. Maya, I think, try the next slide. In contrast to prevalent Shylock-like stereotypes of avarice and meanness. There's a picture of Browning. You decide whether it's Jewish looking. So from the slide, it seems that knowledge of Hebrew and sympathy for Jews for a long time was thought that Browning himself was Jewish. But in fact, that wasn't the case. But it's been suggested that his interest in Jews to some extent may have been due to the fact that his father obtained a position in the Bank of England through the influence of the Rothschilds, with whom Browning, the poet, was personally acquainted. In this country, next slide, in 1875, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was invited to read a poem at his 50th reunion from Bowdoin College. Maya, next slide, please. Whoops, wrong. Go back, I guess. In it, he expressed his belief that while we cannot stop the inexorable march of time, maturity allows for insights that were unachievable in youth. Longfellow acknowledged that it's true that most of us won't do our best work in old age. We'll continue and become better people as we age, and he exhorted his fellow Bowdoin alumni to continue to work and dream even as they age. He said this: "Age is an opportunity, no less than youth itself, though in another dress. For age is opportunity, and as the evening twilight fades away, the sky is filled with stars invisible by day." So now I'd like to discuss a very different kind of literature, one with which I'm much more familiar, and that's medical literature. And I'm going to describe several doctors who were influential in developing a new specialty that today we call geriatrics. Now we can, at a German medical meeting in 1906, this man, a Bavarian psychiatrist by the name of Alois Alzheimer, described the case of a 50-year-old woman whom he'd followed for 5 years because of paranoia, sleep and memory disturbances, and progressive confusion. And after her death, on postmortem examination, certain abnormalities were found in her brain, today called plaques and tangles. And he theorized that these were related to her symptoms. Alzheimer concluded that his patient had a rare form of dementia that may affect people under age 65, and he called her condition pre-senile dementia. And his report excited very little interest, except from his colleague, Emil Kraepelin, who in his own book that was written in 1910, named the condition Alzheimer's disease. 5 years later, Alzheimer died at age 51, which was long before his name became a household word. About the same time in New York City, Dr. Ignaz Nasher was obsessed with disorders common to old age. He was born in Vienna in 1863, but was brought to the United States as an infant. His formal schooling eventually led to a degree in pharmacy, and then in 1885, an MD degree from NYU. And when Nasher entered medical practice, he worked for a while in outpatient clinics at Mount Sinai Hospital. And in 1909, he published a book called The Wretches of Povertyville, a sociologic study of the Bowery. And in this book, Nasher describes societal antipathy toward the elderly. He wrote that the idea of economic worthlessness instills a spirit of irritability, if not positive enmity, against the helplessness of the aged. In an article in the New York Medical Journal in 1909, he introduced the new term geriatrics, derived from the Greek geros, meaning old man, and iatrikos, medical treatment. And 5 years later, he expanded on this in a 517-page book, Geriatrics, The Diseases of Old Age. He wrote this: I would suggest, as an addition to our vocabulary, to cover the same field that is covered in old age, that is covered by the term pediatrics, to emphasize the necessity of considering senility and its disease apart from maturity, and to assign it a separate place in medicine. So little has been done in the field of geriatrics that until it receives the attention it deserves, and we know more about the changes in the period of decline, we must fall back upon empiricism in the treatment of diseases in old age. In 1931, Nasher was put in charge of the 1,200-bed City Farm colony on Roosevelt Island, what later became Goldwater Hospital. But at the time of his death in 1944, he remained disappointed that the field of geriatrics hadn't made great strides. Clearly, he had been years ahead of his time, but it wasn't until after the end of World War II that interest finally boomed in what some had called the forgotten discipline. But that would change, especially thanks to a psychiatrist at Mount Sinai by the name of Robert Butler. As a medical resident working in an emergency room, Butler often heard old patients referred to as gomers, meaning get out of my emergency room. And in 1969, 100 years after Nasher had introduced the term geriatrics, Butler coined a term of his own, ageism, to describe a societal attitude of bias against older adults. And he wrote that the last prejudice that's permitted is toward older people. He said, you don't make fun of the disabled or blacks or women, but many lawmakers bemoan the burden that baby boomers were putting on social programs. And the prevalent feeling was that the elderly were a drain on society rather than a resource, something that had to be done, although not necessarily as drastic as Anthony Trollope had imagined for the citizens of Britannula. So Dr. Butler deplored the fact that societal fears of aging and death fueled negative stereotypes, and he described ageism as the existential problem of our time that nobody wants to talk about. And he argued that such prejudices not only reduced their opportunities for a satisfactory life, but undermined their personal dignity and denied them the opportunity to reinvent themselves. And he went on to found and lead the International Longevity Center and later the National Institute on Aging. And partially as a result of his work, Medicare and Medicaid were passed in 1966, as well as other legislation to protect citizens from age-related discrimination. Butler's book, Why Survive Being Old in America, won the Pulitzer Prize. A later book was The Longevity Revolution. And he wrote, the tragedy of old age is not the fact that each of us must grow old and die, but that the process of doing so has been made unnecessary and at times excruciatingly painful, humiliating, debilitating, and isolating through insensitivity, ignorance, and poverty. Now, for a change of pace, it seems that these days, in any serious discussion, it's hard to avoid at least mentioning artificial intelligence. So naturally, when I began my research for this talk, I sought some AI-generated assistance. So I asked ChatGPT, what's the secret of aging well? And within seconds, here's what it replied, and in verse. To age well, there's no secret, no magic potion or pill. It's a simple formula, one that you can follow still. Eat a healthy diet, get plenty of exercise, take care of your mind and body, and your spirit will rise. Spend time with loved ones, do things you enjoy, live each day to the fullest, and you'll age with joy. Aging is a journey, not a destination, so make the most of it and enjoy every step of the way. Not bad, ChatGPT. So next, I asked a different chatbot called Bard AI to imagine a conversation between Adam and Eve after they'd been married for some 900 years. And I wondered what they talked about after such a long time. So here's what Bard, not the Bard of Stratford-on-Avon, but the chatbot called Bard, this is what it came up with. A scene. An elderly Adam and Eve are sitting in their rocking chairs on the porch of their cabin. They're both frail and wrinkled and have been married for over 900 years. Adam says, I can't believe you're still nagging me after all these years. Eve says, well, you deserve it. You're always forgetting things and you never listen to me. Adam says, that's not true. I listen to you all the time. Eve says, oh, please, you're the most stubborn man I've ever met. Never let it be said that AI doesn't have a sense of humor and perhaps a touch of misogyny. Obviously, every case differs. There are an enormous number of books, past and present, fact and fiction, about aging and ageism. Some foster stereotypes of grumpy, frail geezers, while others convey a positive perspective. And hopefully, that's what these talks are all about. But before closing, I'd like to cite just a few more wise people whom I've admired. In 1961, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel spoke at the first White House Conference on Aging, his speech called To Grow in Wisdom. And in it, he cautioned about the perils of loneliness and the fear of time. Heschel declared that being old is not necessarily the same as being stale. And he added that we all have been given the gift of time, and no matter what age we may be, we can use that gift to sanctify every moment. As he said, just to be is a blessing, just to live is holy. My fellow Bronx boy and friend, the late Yale surgeon Sherwin Newland, published a book in 2010 called The Art of Aging, a Doctor's Prescription for Well-Being. And I'd like to quote a few lines. So long as we're actively engaged in a career, we must abide more or less strictly to the boundaries imposed by it. But once we begin to separate ourselves, bit by bit, we become freer to continue maturing in ways distinctive to ourselves. By such means, age becomes a liberator. It is never too late to find new tributaries that add vibrancy to our lives. As our 60s and 70s approach, we must increasingly take deliberate steps of our own. The well springs of creativity lie everywhere to be discovered. They may appear in the most improbable of forms and at the most unexpected times. We should not wait for that appearance. We should seek it out. In closing, I'd like also to quote the famous philosopher Yogi Berra. Although usually he was a man of few words, and he certainly wasn't a writer, when Yogi spoke, his insights often were memorable. And famously, the Yankee great once said, "It ain't over till it's over." And I suggest that covers a lot more than first, second, and third bases. And I recommend that that message is worth pondering and even pursuing. And finally, for an encore, consider this. The world-famous Pablo Casals lived to age 96, and he had a lifelong morning routine. He would start each day by eating 2 soft-boiled eggs for breakfast, and then he'd sit down at the piano and he'd play several scales, and then he'd get up, and next he would play one of Bach's 6 cello suites. On Monday, he'd play suite number 1, on Tuesday, number 2, and so on, until on weekend mornings, he'd play number 6 both days, because apparently it was the hardest. And when Casals was in his 90s, a student asked him why he kept on practicing the very same cello pieces after all these years. And the maestro's reply was simple. He said, "I think that I'm making progress." Like Yogi Berra had said, it ain't over till it's over. Yogi and Pablo were 2 geniuses who thought alike. So that's all, folks. But before the Q&A, I have an apology. And the apology is that if you've been paying attention, except for a picture of Eve, everybody I've discussed and whose faces I've projected were men, mostly bearded men. That omission was inadvertent. I didn't notice it until just yesterday. Women age too, usually without the beards. And so if it makes you feel any better, some of the very best books that I read in my research were written by the likes of Roseanne Leipzig, Louise Aronson, Sarah Lightfoot, Becca Levy. Nevertheless, I plead guilty. I did that wrong. So mea culpa. And next week, Dr. Jeffrey Levine, my good friend, will be speaking. And after that, other of my friends and colleagues. So I hope you tune in again. So ready for comments and questions, Maya?
Thank you so much, Michael. That was so much history in such a succinct format, and we really went all the way from prehistory all the way until almost today. And I wanted to kind of start the Q&A myself with jumping onto what you were mentioning about some of the modern day work about aging. And I'm curious whether you see the literary work about aging today as a continuation of the work you discussed today. Is there a really hard change that you've noticed with the work today, or do you see it as kind of a natural, gradual continuation?
I think there is an extensive contemporary literature. I mean, there's practically a week that goes by, if not a day that goes by, that something doesn't appear in newspapers or in published books. So it's on everybody's mind. And I read at least, or at least skimmed, at least a dozen books that have been published in just the last few years. Each one a little bit from a different perspective, but nonetheless showing much greater sensitivity. And I see Bonnie's photo there. Bonnie was the one who suggested this subject to me. She said, I think Bonnie was very disturbed about what we were seeing about politics these days. I was particularly concerned about the beautiful cartoony cover on the New Yorker a few months ago by Barry Blitt, showing Biden and Trump and McConnell and, I guess, Nancy Pelosi pushing walkers. And that was an ageist idea. It was amusing, but I think it sends the wrong message. And so that was one of our motives in having a series of conferences that from very different perspectives discusses aging, not as a disaster, but as perhaps an opportunity. Of course, it all depends upon health and wealth and good genes and most importantly, good luck. Not falling down and breaking something. But I think we've come a long way. But it's interesting to me, and the reason I took this historic approach was to show that these problems have been around from the beginning of time. And I do think that we're making progress, but perhaps not fast enough.
We have some more questions in the chat. Actually, this is very timely from Marcia Launer because she asks about the ethics of euthanasia, and we're actually going to be covering that, learning a lot about that in our third session of this series with Dr. Littman and Mr. Cantor, who are going to be talking about end-of-life theories, ethics. So definitely tune in for the remainder of the series, where we're going to be discussing ethical, religious, and medical issues surrounding end of life, and also living life to the fullest and aging well, as we're terming it. We also have a question from Beth Rosseler, who asks about books that you would recommend, Dr. Nevins, to help folks dealing with issues revolving around aging, such as she mentions back toward life and dealing with how to proceed with life with enthusiasm.
I have a list here. I'll just read them off quickly. Some of them have to do with current research that's going on. There's one in particular that interests me called Age Later by a physician at Montefiore near Barzilai, who is Israeli. And it's about a study going on now of 90-year-olds and up who are taking a drug that I take every day for my type 2 diabetes. And there's some evidence that it may be helpful. That book is Age Later, and I recommend that. Another is Aging Well by George Vaillant, Vaillant. An excellent book by Louise Aronson is Elderhood. Another by Becca Levy is Breaking the Age Code. And one of the things that she mentions is that in addition to diet and exercise and all the other familiar do's and don'ts, attitude matters. Having a positive attitude about aging is very important and translates into better health. And another one is Roseanne Leipzig, who spoke at our live meeting 2 weeks ago. She's at Mount Sinai. Her book is called, Honest Aging. Then there's Dan Buettner, who's kind of a salesman. His book is called The Blue Zones, and it's about 5 places around the world, in Croatia and Sardinia and so forth. The only one in the United States being Loma Linda, California, where people live just disproportionately long, many centenarians, much more than the norm elsewhere. And as I mentioned earlier, my late friend Sherwin Newland's The Art of Aging, a doctor's prescription for well-being. If you didn't catch all of that, I'm sure Maya can provide that. But
yeah, we do have some requests for that list after the fact. So if you'd like to send that, I can distribute that to the folks who've registered. Sure. We actually have a question from Dr. Jeffrey Levine, who's our next speaker next week, about A Geriatrician Looks at Aging, where we're going to talk about his work in geriatrics and also his photography. But he mentions he was interested in the AI version of section of your talk, and he said he couldn't help but notice the AI printouts you received were rife with ageist stereotypes. Not surprising given the fact that AI scrapes the internet for its info that is repackaged and spit back out. What else did you find in your AI quest?
Oh, I didn't go exhaustively into it. I was amused by that, but I think Jeff's point is a good one, that since it harvests material that's already out there, it just goes to prove the point that although there are some good books that I've just mentioned, there's a lot of bad information and misinformation that's also out there. So you have to accept AI for what it is, which with a grain of salt. Yeah.
Definitely. And I'm going to allow folks to unmute themselves. If anyone would like to raise their hand and ask a question verbally to Dr. Nevins, you're welcome to. So please do if you'd like. Are there any more questions? We have some more things in my direct messages. We actually have one question in my direct messages about the kind of new concept of the super agers, and what that I'm going to combine that with another question that I have in my DMs about if there's any new issues surrounding aging in this modern era that we haven't really seen before that need to be addressed.
Well, the superagers is a term, it's not a scientific term, but generally it's talking about the 100-year-olds, so those people who are the big winners or maybe losers. But you know, once again, there are a bunch of YouTube talks, there are TED talks, and a lot of them, there's a problem when I watch them. There's some of it is the science is distorted or overread, and so you have to be cautious, and you know, because the folks who are doing the TED Talks and selling books, you know, they have a distinct point of view, and so you shouldn't just automatically accept what you hear as the gospel. But you know, the convention, I don't believe, for example, that the things that I've read concerning conventional recommendations about diet, that you know, that avoiding meats or following a Mediterranean style diet, that they stand up to scrutiny scientifically. You know, like so much, you can find almost anything on the internet, and or on television or on YouTube, and very often the slickest and the most you know, convincing are very often the people who are just promoting something that they've got a financial interest in. So I think you have to be careful. I mean, obviously, it's not healthy. Remember, I mentioned that the world record for the longest living human being, 122-year-old French woman, she smoked till the end. And there are many Henry Kissinger. Biden spoke with the president of China a couple of weeks ago in San Francisco, but Henry Kissinger last summer, I think in August, flew to Beijing to meet with the President Xi. And when Kissinger had his 100th birthday, his family reports that he still smokes cigars and he eats all the wrong things. And so, you know, very many of these superagers that may be just plain dumb luck or extremely good genes. I'm counting on good genes because my mother died at 96 and her sisters were over 100. So I'm holding out. I'm a kid, though. I'm only 87 and a half. So I've got a ways to go. But no, so I don't know that there's any magic formula.
Actually, we have a question from Alan Littman. He asks if there's a remedy for the quote unquote disorder that we term ageism. Some centenarians function at a higher level than others in their 80s, which I think goes back to what you and I were discussing before everyone came in, Dr. Nevins, about how, you know, different ages look different on every individual.
Yeah, I agree. Incidentally, Alan will be one of the speakers in 2 weeks. The person who asked about end-of-life care, that's going to be an excellent panel, giving both a medical, ethical, and a legal perspective. So I certainly recommend that people who are interested in that subject should tune in.
Definitely. And I think as far as addressing Alan Littman's question, if there's a remedy for ageism, I think honestly programs like this really shed light on the issue. And I think the panel that we had, the in-person panel discussion, which that recording, if you weren't able to come to the in-person panel, that video within the next couple weeks, or hopefully within the next week, will be up on the Museum at Aldridge Street YouTube channel. So I would really encourage you to hear from both from Dr. Nevins and also from our esteemed panelists, including Roseanne Leipzig, whose book Dr. Nevins recommended earlier, to definitely see what they had to say about that, because it was a really enlightening panel. Is there anyone else who'd like to ask a question to Dr. Nevins before we leave today?
It's Bonnie. I just want to say how thrilled I am that, oh, I have to sign something. Do I have to sign?
No, you did.
How thrilled I am that meeting you and Dr. Jeffrey Levine at Mark Podwell's talk on that rainy, rainy night has brought us to this stage where we are learning and growing. And everybody who knows me knows that I love birthdays, mine, yours, and everybody else's. And I'm just overwhelmed with the amount of learning that took place and will continue to take place. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie.
And I think let's end with, we have one last question in the chat box. We have a question from Margot who asks about how to engage younger generations in talks about ageism, in your opinion, and how to really reach every single age group about these issues and have everyone, have everyone respond in a thoughtful way.
Oh, wow, that's a big one. I don't know that I have some special insight. Obviously, the more, it's interesting. I'm 87 and a half, and one of my intellectual hobbies is genealogy. And for 40 years, I've been studying my family's roots in Eastern Europe, and particularly in what's now northeastern Poland. My grandparents came out in the 1890s to the States. So I've 3 or 4 times been back and visited the shtetl from where my paternal grandparents came. And this past summer, on my 4th trip, I brought 5 of my 7 grandchildren and 2 of my 3 adult children. And, they've known that their papa has been interested in the subject for a long time, but only when we went together as a group, and they saw what I've been talking about and writing about for all these years. There was nothing more educational than that. It's just doing things and going places. And, in a couple of weeks, we're going off on our annual family vacation. And so 3 generations are together and loving each other. And there's nothing more important than human relations and communication. I don't think I said that very well, but I think that's there's a lot of truth to that. So
Bravo.
Definitely. And I think that's a fantastic way to end. And I'd just like to also put back on the screen the other series that we have. Here we have all the series. Please go to eldridgestreet.org/events, and you could register for the next 3 sessions in this virtual series. We really look forward to seeing you at each one. And even if you can't make it, please register, because we do have recordings available. So if you are registered, you will get all communications about that program, including the recordings. So I really encourage you to register for any of the programs if you're interested. And lastly, I'd like to thank Dr. Nevins. We will see you in exactly a week, right back here with our first special guest, Jeffrey Levine, who is going to be talking about his work in geriatrics and his photography of aging folks from all over the world. That is really just a spectacular collection, and magazine covers, which I'll tell you all about. So for now, goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today.